What is it like to be an author? Today, I would like to focus on a question that some of you may have already asked themselves. It is a question that probably every author at some point in their career asks themselves. The question is whether you can consider yourself a writer. Now, if you listened to my previous video, you're probably already familiar with the answer I'm trying to give here. The question of whether you can consider yourself a writer is pretty much unnecessary. It doesn't affect your writing. Also, for that matter, it won't improve your writing if you consider yourself a writer. But I wanted to dive a little deeper into this question, why we asked such a question. Also, by shedding light on this question, I think you can reveal deeper questions about identity. We all have certain roles within our lives, and we use those roles to, for example, introduce ourselves. We are readily assigning us with these roles on a probably daily basis, to the degree that we actually think about ourselves as these roles. But is it really true that as a human being, you are just a collection of the roles that you fulfill in society? You know the answer. Of course, there is more to being a human being. Of course, but also being a human being. How is that defined? Isn't that just another role? So the original question of what is it like to be an author, when can you consider yourself an author, brings us to much deeper questions. But let's first discuss what possible answers are to that question. If you look at the writing industry, you can see several examples of writers. You probably consider these people as writers because they published a novel or book. Now, there's of course differences in genre, but by way of reducing the complexity, we all refer to them as authors or writers. This is fairly obvious, but what we just revealed is that this identification happens on an interpersonal basis. It happens between people. But what about identifying yourself as an author? You could take the approach and say, because X amount of people identify me as a writer, I consider myself a writer. This reflection causes people to think about themselves in a certain way. But is it really other people who can tell you what you really are, how you feel? I don't think that they can. I don't think that we have any idea of how other people feel about themselves, nor can we ever do that. The only thing that we know is how we feel like. And in order to communicate with others, we assign ourselves these roles and call ourselves writers. So now we understood that this question is probably answered from a subjective perspective. Basically, everyone has their own definition of what it is like to be an author. But still the question remains if we ever feel when we become a writer. For example, you could say that after I publish my first novel, I can consider myself a writer. But if you make such a statement, if you know that in the next couple of months you will publish your first novel, do you really know whether at that point you will consider yourself a writer? You don't know this. There's no guarantees. On the other hand, if you already published a novel and consider yourself a writer, good job. But now what? Did anything really change? Did it change your daily experience? It might have changed your tax statements, but it didn't really change you as a person. So the next time you ask yourself the question, when will I consider myself a writer? You should know that it's pretty much up to you when you reach that point, and what it even means to you to be a writer. All of which means that it's pretty much useless to even think about it. And now, to return to my first video, what we should do instead is focus on our work. Writing. I hope I was able to explain my thoughts so that you can understand them. I'm very interested in these kinds of questions. Alright, a quick update on my novel. I'm currently in the process of finishing the last chapters. There has been some back and forth between plotting and actually writing. I have known the ending since a couple of months now, but at some point I always reach a point where I don't know how to progress. Then what helped out is plotting. This takes a couple of days and brings me to the question of what we really mean by writing. I'll probably discuss that in another video. What I also want to discuss is plotting. The question whether you should actually plot or whether you should grow your story organically. Hopefully, you already know my answer. Currently, I'm in the fortunate state I know how the story should progress, but at some point, I'm sure, I will reach a point where I'm stuck. You can consider this writer's block. Whether you should actually apply such a term to your writing, well, you know the answer. But still, I'd like to discuss with you on how I approach writer's block. But let's discuss that in later videos. Anyways, I hope you have a great day and see you in the next video.